So, yeah, I think we could probably get started. It's great to see so many familiar names in the participant list, and we'll welcome anyone who comes along um, as I talk. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land currently known as the province of Saskatchewan is comprised of portions of lands from Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. The territories of the Nehewak, the Anishkabek, Dene, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. So my name is Belinda Harrow, and I'm the consultant for the Saskarts Permanent Collection here at Saskarts. I recognize privilege has allowed me, like my ancestors before me, to travel freely, claiming space here in Treaty 4 territory in Regina, where I live and work. I personally strive to build strong relationships with all those who now share the lands. I recognize my responsibility to these people and the land, the animals, the plants, and the waters upon which we all rely. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of Saskarts Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Speaker Series. We at Saskarts recognize that the original principles upon which public arts funding began in Canada were highly racist and meant to prioritize white Eurocentric artistic forms. And these principles still form the basis of the structures that are in operation today. So like many of your companies, we have taken an intentional approach to ED&I at Saskarts. We know there is work to do, and we are committed to the process. In addition to these series, we are working with community stakeholders to improve accessibility, and that includes incorporating that into our strategic plan. As we do, we're interested in hearing from the community as we work towards this common goal. So Saskarts is devoting significant internal resources to this work, including hearing from speakers who are challenging us to be better and do better. As we benefit from this professional development, we thought it was important to share some of this work with you, the arts community in the province, as a way of providing resources that go beyond grants and funding. So we hope this speaker series can stimulate all of us in our work to address the complex web of inequities in the Saskatchewan and Canadian arts communities. So before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to provide just several friendly reminders that will help this talk be a good experience for all participants. So number one, we have closed captioning available for this series. To access the captioning, please click on the Live Otter AI button at the top left of your screen. The captioning will open in a different browser window, and you can follow along with the conversation there. During the presentation, please turn off your cameras and your microphones. If you're a brave person and you want to ask a question at the end in person, then we'll ask you to pop your microphone and your video on then and raise your hand, and you can come into view. We'd really appreciate that and enjoy that. You could also, if you prefer, and you're a little shyer or you just want to put it in writing, you can put your question into the chat, and John and I will both keep an eye on it. He may answer during his talk, or he might wait till the end. I think that's his choice. And just so you know, we are recording today's session so that we can make it available through Saskart's website. So in case you want to view it again later, or in a few weeks, it'll be available and you could send the link to colleagues who weren't able to make the talk today. So today's speaker is a really good friend of Saskarts. He's been an important facilitator to our learning over the last year and a half as the agency has undertaken a disability audit. I'm thrilled to introduce John Loeppky, writer, theater artist, advocate, and currently, begrudgingly maybe, student still at the University of Regina, doing a master's in fine arts, where he's focusing on disability, identity, and solo performance. I encourage you to visit John's website, where you can read a selection of his writing, freelance writing, including articles written for publications such as the Globe and Mail, CBC, Money Sense, and even Teen Vogue, which I thought was great. So there's a wide variety of writing there. I was really impressed with John's writing. So as a visual person, um, so thanks, John, and yeah,
Thank
welcome
you.
to our speaker series.
Thank you. Yeah, I wrote for Teen Vogue despite very much not being a teen. So I'm very thankful for that opportunity. It was actually talking about barriers to disabled politicians, of all things. But today, I'm going to be talking about disability art. So I want to start with some thank yous. You may see me looking away. That's because I have some notes in front of me because, my memorization skills even on things such as intros, are not the best some days. So I want to thank Sask Arts for inviting me and including those who are in the call today. I'd also like to thank the people without whom I wouldn't be here today. At least one of them is in the chat. Others maybe as well. Tracy Foster and the team that listened to this. Without them, I quite simply wouldn't be an artist. And I don't say that so that the team over there can then cut it and put it into grant support material, although perhaps they can. Because apparently I'm incapable of being earnest without making a joke. But well and truly, and we'll come to that as part of this talk, there is no way in which I could be doing the work that I do in the sectors that I do without the backing of disabled artists like those that listen to this. We already heard a land acknowledgement. I just want to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 6. And I also want to acknowledge that the history of disability advocacy and activism, which I view this talk in the vein of, because disability culture is at its core political, the history of that has been incredibly white and quite abled even within the disability community. And so I want to acknowledge that I come from a certain vantage point and want to make sure that there is increased space for others, even if I'm the one with the mic today. Speaking of access needs, like I said, I may look away, I may take a pause, and you're welcome to put things in the chat. I tend to answer them as I go, but I may delay it till later, and there will also be ample time closer to the end of this talk where you get to lob questions at me, in order for if you have any burning questions. And I'm also thankful for those who are watching this on the recording and can come back to it, or people who are here and want to return to it for access related reasons. I gave a little bit of a visual introduction earlier when I was talking about the art behind me, but I'll give one for myself as well. I'm a white, I used to say mid-20s, but I'm 29, so I think I better give that up. Man, I use he, him pronouns. I have a set of gray headphones on and brown hair that is way too long covering my face. I am in a black collared t-shirt, and you can't see them, but I'm also wearing black dress pants. I made a joke this morning that it looks like I'm going to a funeral for ableism, but I think we can all agree that ableism isn't dead yet, but hopefully we can make a dent. A little bit of a note before I get into this. You'll note that I have a little bit of a focus on humor when I'm doing these things. This is because it's hard to talk about disability, inclusion, access, disability within the EDI framework without talking about some difficult stuff. Within that, I'll be using some reclaimed language, most often crip or crippled, which we will get into when we talk about crip and or disability culture. Okay, and we're actually going to start right away, because this talk I have jokingly titled Unapologetically Crip, because that's what I am. My Twitter bio says crippled and creative, and for me those two realities have always been central. Even when I wasn't using those words, I was the kid that was making disability jokes the entire time. that I was in space with other people, much sometimes to their chagrin, where, when a 12-year-old won't do anything except make fun of the fact that their legs don't work properly, people get bored sometimes. Today I'm going to talk about disability art and culture, but I'm also going to talk about the barriers that are presented for disabled artists in Saskatchewan and in Canada. And again, this is coming from one lens, but I hope to bring forward some of the things that people are facing and some of the disruption that is happening. It can be very easy for disability culture, particularly as we're coming to an understanding of disability as a culture, provincially, nationally, and internationally, that it's complicated. and in doing so, I want to highlight some of the work that is being done. Not to bury the lead any further than I already have, to use a journalism metaphor, but I also want to disrupt the idea that I'm an expert. I think often disability gets left out of EDI conversations, and I think disability has a key role to play, not only within its own sphere of influence, shall we call it, but also within intersectionality and collaboration. But why I say I don't consider myself an expert is I think that there is a hierarchical sense to expertise. Arguments could be made that I'm not an expert on my own lived experience. It's far too wrapped up in complications between sport and art and academia and moving to Canada at age 11 for me to ever hope that I've remembered everything and remembered everything faithfully, which is something that I've been challenging myself with the endless MFA work. I call it the endless MFA because I've run into a number of barriers, not all of them academic. And I'm thankful to my two supervisors. I want to state my connections here, Dr. Jess Battis and Dr. Leanne Grubenfeld, for their support throughout that process that is chugging towards an end, hopefully, in April. My connections come, as I mentioned, from Listen to Dis, the University of Regina, my parasport career. I always said I got to go to a bunch of cool stuff, but never anything important. So not a Paralympian, but 2 Canada Games medals, some time with the junior national team, and Rookie of the Year in wheelchair rugby, which just meant I got a discount on a wheelchair, which is the most disability thing ever. And then also the Carillon, our student newspaper, and the many editors, writers, and collaborators that I get to work with now. I'm going to start with how I became an artist, and it's still a term that friends maybe chuckle at me a little bit, because unlike others who are very, I am an artist and that is what I am, and I'm willing to put that front and center, I've always had a complicated relationship with the term artist. It was Listen to Dis, again, that made me realize that I was one. But long before that, I was writing in high school. This is an often quoted thing, but when people ask you why you came to poetry, for example, and they say people often come to poetry on their knees because they're looking for some, I guess the connotation is that it's some kind of salvation from poetry, and certainly writing for me has always been the release. My parents were always fairly convinced I was going to become a writer, and I was fairly convinced I wasn't, and shock surprise, they were right, as usual, and now they will have that in a recording. But I didn't truly think that I was anywhere close to an artist, really, until I took a class at the U of R called Devising Inclusive Theater. And I'll save you the long and the short of that, is that that involved collaborating with Tracy and a number of others. But during that performance, and it's a story that we tell often, I posted about the last time that I'd been on stage, keeping in mind that in this class I was 22. And I posted on Facebook the night before the final performance, or the morning of perhaps, that it would be my first time on stage since I was 11. And the top comment were people going, from the people in the class that I was collaborating with, who went, "What? Why?" And part of that, I can blame my high school for many things, I think. My lack of theater participation was not one of them. That parasport schedule sort of took me away. But I, I won an award in elementary school for my time on stage. I got to play a disabled king, which meant that I didn't have to do the dance parts. I had these sort of dabbling in theater. My family is very creative and artistic, I would say. When we went to physio when I was in Britain, my mom would bribe me, not with candy, although I'm sure that happened as well, but we would go to the British National History Museum, or we would go to the West End. So yeah, my first theater show, sounds very pretentious, but the first theater show that I remember seeing was The Lion King in the West End. Promise I won't be as pretentious as we go through this talk, as to keep talking about which shows I went to, but really it's to give you a sense that not just because of my disability, but partially, I just didn't see myself as an artist. What I did see myself as, though, was an athlete. And again, I won't overstate my accomplishments, but a collaborator that I've worked with on a dance project once said to me that, athletics and sport, you may not think of yourself as a dancer for this particular project, but sport is a movement practice at its core. And I happen to believe that, and I happen to believe that there's a bit too much of a divide between athletes and artists. And parasport, maybe because there's a bunch of parasport athletes that ended up as artists, I see that divide dissolving away, and I'm hoping that it continues to do so. Sport is also where I learned to navigate the barriers that I would then use later in my creative life, because nothing quite stress tests accessibility like taking 15 disabled people to a basketball tournament. Just the same as nothing quite stress tests accessibility than taking The Other Ordinary, the Listen to Dis's touring theater company, across Saskatchewan, which I would do a few years later and play a role. I'll leave it up to others as to how to declare what that role was. And that brings us to one of the barriers that disabled artists face. Disabled artists face, beyond, even if you've battled through the educational barriers, the perception barriers, there are still things you bump into. Disability is messy. Access is messy. Part of the reason that this talk has so many caveats in it as we talk about access is that we're working to create as much access as we can. And that means that we will fail. Access will fail. If I was asked to do this in person, for example, I wouldn't be able to at the current moment. And so this is about navigating. And I think the arts ecology, not just in our province, but nationally, is radically uncomfortable with that discomfort. When people would ask me about access in theater, I would point to the equity agreement that basically just says thou shalt not discriminate. And that doesn't give very much room for actors to figure out actually what they are allowed to ask for, because it's always what we're allowed to ask for. It's not what we need. And that's one of the key challenges facing disabled artists, in my view, and facing the ecology. The connected one is that I think as artists, and this is certainly proven out during my career, we view ourselves as progressive, often because we are. We view ourselves as caring, but often within disability that can mean that we view ourselves as past. We're past ableism, or I'm not discriminatory against disabled people because I've worked with them, or something like this. I can very easily, slip into say something that is incorrect about somebody's disability. It's why I don't say that I'm an expert. I can speak about, for example, how I use a wheelchair and whether that can move through a particular door, but I can't speak to any other wheelchair user. One of the dangers of the ecology is that disabled people, like other marginalized communities, have been reduced to what I will call a checkbox narrative. This narrative that, we have one, therefore we are accessible. But oftentimes that disabled person isn't involved in the process, is left off to a corner. I call them the sad cripples in the corner, because we are sad, because we are in the corner. And it leaves us only, I think, wanting to make art with people that we trust. And when that list becomes smaller and smaller, that becomes an impediment to progress. For example, oftentimes EDI initiatives work towards access. When that work goes wrong is when it refuses to atone for the past, because it's very easy to look forward with hopeful eyes. I think Parasport is one of the things that taught me that I could look forward with hopeful eyes. I don't think the arts did that for me very often. But we need to look in the past, and this is as true for disabled artists as well, needing to acknowledge where access fell down, where people felt othered by the process. And often when we talk about disability in the arts, we do talk about somebody like me. We do talk about a super crip, which is a term that just means somebody that is seen as hyper-abled, even if they are disabled. Thinking of or the Rick Hansons or Patrick Andersons of the world. Patrick Anderson being a Paralympian in wheelchair basketball. We often get tied into this super crip narrative, but the reality is there are many disabled people who, because of the ableism in the arts ecology, choose not to, and essentially it's a coming out process of sorts. So, I mean, maybe it's my bias as a disabled person, but I go into a room presuming that there are other disabled people in the room, even if disability is never spoken about except as perceived, as me being perceived as a disabled person. Not just because you can Google my diagnosis, not just because I came out as having mental health disabilities on CBC radio, yet another example of me not taking the easy road, but because I believe that access is foundational. And I think access is often forgotten unless we're hit across the head with it. Access, this is a refrain you'll hear often. Access is not just a nice to have, right? It's foundational to the human rights of disabled artists. And before this sounds too much like me standing on a soapbox, because I'm far too physically unstable for that, I'm going to give you an example. So one of the ways that disability and access can float around is how performances come to be. So for example, load-in schedules for theater are often relying on a non-disabled version of time. A version of time where you can get up when you want to, you can move things around, you can rush, theoretically. You can do all of these things to meet specific deadlines and times, and you can work 10 out of 12s. But when we're doing promo for a show, or I'm doing promo for a show, often the reason that I get as much camera time as I do is that I don't have a medical routine that takes 3 hours in the morning. I picked a random number there, but I don't have home care to worry about. I can navigate digital platforms with a little barrier. I do have the financial backing, although much of it was bought with money I earned as an artist for the equipment I need to be able to present digitally like this with a half-decent mic. These are barriers that disabled people in Canada disproportionately are bumping up against. We have educational barriers. Oftentimes we look at award ceremonies, right? Like we look at an artist who is going to accept a Tony Award or was nominated for a stage award. And I can't actually remember if it was a Tony Award, and I don't have it in my notes. But and she sent a photo from backstage on Instagram, and it was her behind one of the flats for the show because they hadn't thought about accessible seating, right? So we're the same, but we're also less than. I'm going to shift now to Saskatchewan because I've talked a quite broad brush about what access can mean. In Saskatchewan, we don't currently we passively acknowledge disability as a culture, and the importance of disability culture, keeping in mind that, granted, and this is one of the moments where I will pull out a pretentious statement, I did recently write the definition of disability culture in Canada for the Canadian Encyclopedia. Deaf culture, interestingly, already had an entry, so I'm glad to see that that existed. And I'm glad that Clayton, my editor, happy to shout you out, was willing to take on a piece about disability culture. Disability culture connects us to our histories. We struggle to know our histories in this province, particularly when it relates to disability. We struggle to learn about the history of organizations, but we also struggle to learn about something as simple as, I don't know if I asked a high school student today if they'd know who Tracy Latimer was. I think people of a generation would. When I was in high school, it was an essay question, but that's about as far as we got. But beyond that, and this is I bought my first basketball chair off of this person, but do we know the history of Colette Begonia, who now has a school in Saskatoon named after her, a many multi-time Paralympian in two sports who now educates around the province. Beyond that, if we go even further back, do we understand that Tommy Douglas, who we're often very willing to shout out, is somebody as a product of this province in many ways, was originally a eugenicist. His master's was on the definition of a perfect family, essentially, giant air quotes around that, right? We know what that means in the time period that he was writing about. We have to know our disability history, and it doesn't mean that we have to know an exhaustive disability history, but so much of that is lost to time, or lost to ignorance in a way, not time. Because if we don't know our histories, we can't talk about our futures. And if we don't know our histories, then it's very difficult to see disabled people as part of a whole. It's very difficult to do the atonement that I talked about. And it's very difficult for us to see CRIP creativity and CRIP culture as a part of the future of Saskatchewan's theatre ecology. I wrote a piece for the Saskatchewan Arts Alliance, and content warnings here, because I will talk about it, and that piece does talk about severe mental health concerns and depression and some ideation. But that piece, which I can link to for Chip when this goes up on the website, talked about how the arts gave me a mental health crisis. I want to be clear here. Listen to this, and the work of the nonprofit was the only thing stopping me from within my work from going further down that hole. The ecology forced me to take a deep look at whether I could physically and mentally be able to continue. Because throughout that, and I've written about it, and I was very public about it, there were a lot of meetings, and this is no shame to any individuals if we shared space during that time period. There were many meetings, both inside and outside of arts work, that was essentially questioning humanity. Now, people didn't probably perceive it as that. They didn't intend it as that. It's not like I was in a meeting and people were like, so, John, you're crippled. Why should we care? But it was this constant advocating, and it still is constant activism, to see disability art and disability culture as worthy of support. We're starting to see a little bit more, and I'm glad. There were many things that I was involved in, and again, I come to this talk speaking individually. Listen to this becomes part of the discussion because it's just key to my artist identity. We need to be comfortable as an arts community with engaging with what we don't know. And we don't know a hell of a lot about disability. And that, I would argue, includes the disabled artists. Part of that is the art psychology. Part of that is a lot of knowledge about disability being hidden behind academic barriers. I don't think you should need a bachelor's or a master's degree to talk about disability from an in-tune place. I think that that's a failing of the white tower of academia. But what we can do is we can welcome in people. We can pass the mic. We can provide funding. We can admit what we don't know, and we can come together. And that may sound very, sit around the fire and sing songs and be happy with each other. But part of EDI, for me as a disabled person, is challenging what we actually mean when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Access and inclusion aren't always synonymous. I can have access to a place. You can let me in the room. But if you want to stick me in the corner, I'm not included. And, Unapologetically Crip, the title of today's presentation, is acknowledging that my identity is as much artist as athlete, as much journalist as public speaker, as much educator, I guess, if I'm labeled that, as it is, husband, brother, son, pain in the ass, whatever people want to choose to label me as artist will always be part of that paradigm. But it will also always be tinged with the idea currently within the art space that the arts is incredibly unwelcoming in a lot of ways, whether that's from the financial perspective. The vast majority of disabled people, not only in our province but in the country, are unemployed or underemployed. The barriers to education, whether that's university degrees, whether that's the community theaters, for example, not having the funding to have those access, or whether it's the community attitudes. We have a long way to go, and I don't want to make that sound incredibly pessimistic, which it probably does. But reducing those barriers means, again, engaging in that discomfort, living in that discomfort, and going and looking to voices in other places. And one of the dangers of that, which I'm going to name, is that because disability culture finds its home, its, I guess you could say, spiritual and historical home, I would argue, in the UK. It's becoming more of a conversation and has become a much larger conversation in the US, and it's beginning to go in Canada. But the other thing that we need to understand within the Saskatchewan arts ecology is that disability culture in Vancouver and the sensibilities that you might have there, and the sensibilities you might have in Toronto or Halifax or Ottawa, are going to be radically different from Saskatchewan. And we could sit here, and I've been fairly pessimistic for the last 5 minutes, and talk about all of the barriers, and certainly happy to open up the chat and the discussion as I will in a few minutes. The exciting and optimistic part of that is that we're in early days of understanding disability as a culture. We are, and that is sort of like my arts degree. My arts degree is scary, is wonderful because I can do anything, right? That's what my English degree tells me. And my arts degree is scary as all heck because it means my previous education was doing an education degree, which I didn't finish. But that has a defined path forward. The excitement for disability culture in Saskatchewan, I would argue, is that we can make change. We are early days. We can lead, but we have a heck of a lot of ableism to navigate and to continue to navigate. Access, it's not something you can ever finish doing. And I know that probably sounds fairly trite, but access is something we have to continually engage with, not least for me because I have to engage with what access needs I might have at the beginning of a day. My body and my brain do not behave similarly every day. Sometimes I say stability is a privilege. Brianne Benass, that runs No End in Sight and who I interviewed with CBC, calls it stableism. The discrimination that some disabled people can show other disabled people when they have a lived experience that is fairly constant in terms of how they see themselves and their body and their lived experience. So that's my way of saying that the disability community has to engage in this as well. It's not an us versus them. I think we're in danger if we view it that way. But it is collective action, and unfortunately there is a power imbalance. Society is ableist, and I'm not here to prescribe some sort of utopia, but I am here to say that rising to each other's levels requires clear, definitive, in a way, conversations about how we can create that access. So for me, I do that through writing. I used to do that through sport. Can confidently say I was the only one writing poetry on the team trips to wherever we were going. Probably the only person who would come up with monologues pretending to be a character who was just, another athlete. I can safely say that. I come at it through my writing, whether that's about disability, health, sport, and media. I do that through my work with Listen to This, and my only hope is that we can open up more avenues so that there is more success for not just people like me, because I've been gifted a lot of privilege in my life. I mean, my first job was age 11, timekeeping hockey games. I'm not quite sure if there's a more Canadian job than having to be the guy that clicks the buttons for hockey games on the scoreboard, but there you go. I've been given the opportunities a lot in my life. It's a very long list, and my work and our work is to make sure that this art space is not only welcoming of disabled people, but actually lets go of control and says, right, we need to work on a CRIP timeline. We need to work from, and this is not my lived experience, but for example, we need to work from a space where deaf culture is valued and is leading the process. We need to let go of our perceptions of visually what's happening, for example, with tactile art within the visual art space for folks with visual disabilities. We need to allow, not just allow mad artists into a fold or into a process, but actually acknowledge that lived experience and provide space for that, because those with mental health disabilities, speaking from experience, we have about 2, anxiety and depression, that are commonly understood, and that ignores about 4 billion other lived experiences. There are many areas in which we can improve, and that can be scary. But at the end of the day, if you root yourself in understanding and trying to understand what you don't know, acknowledging that not as some scary monster in the corner, but as a beautiful opportunity for learning, for knowledge growth, and for collective action, um, then we're getting closer to EDI. I'm going to pause because I've been speaking for about 35 minutes straight. Most of you, I think, know me just looking down the list, so are probably used to that paradigm from me. But I want to give a moment to see if there are any questions, particular barriers people want to talk about. Ask me what I had for breakfast, whatever the question may be. Chip asked, are there any barriers or access challenges in general or specific in the arts community that you continually face? You know, Chip, that's a really good question. I believe I mentioned earlier that disabled artists tend to, in my experience anyway, tend to lean towards the people that they trust. I think when I was more of a full-time artist, the barrier that I faced in the arts community was that I well and truly only felt safe with about, I only knew that my access needs were going to be met for sure with about 15 people in this province. And that there are many more that I've never met. I am not like the most well-connected artist ever. But I think because I didn't have that access early on, certainly if you'd have met me in grade 12, collectively as a group, I would never have conceived of myself as an artist. It would have been, I'm an athlete who writes sometimes. There was no real illusions or grandeur, I don't believe. And so I think the answer to that question, I think, is, access early and often. The drama curriculum for Saskatchewan high schools, for example, was updated within the last couple of years, but it hadn't been updated in the previous, whatever that was, 30 years. I believe the last update before that was either the late 80s or the early 90s, and the disability was only mentioned once. Now that curriculum, talks about community engaged arts organizations, name drops a number of them. It talks about access, I believe. I think in order to reduce those barriers, we need to be acknowledging those artists earlier and earlier, because I would argue that, especially for those who, for that moment, I'm talking mostly about people with disabilities who either gained them young or, like me, had them from birth. For those who come into the fold later in life, which is lots of disabled people as well, I think COVID opened up a lot of people to understand themselves as neurodivergent, for example. I think that we need to unpack those processes, and we need to be a space where people can say, hi, these are my access needs. We need to create spaces where disclosure is okay, and that we're foundationally building access from the bottom, even if it shouldn't take somebody saying, hi, I'm disabled, for access to be created. Tracy, I see your hand up.
Is that Tracy Foster's phone, I think? Tracy's phone?
Hi, Tracy.
Are we able to hear her? Her mute is off.
Her mute is off, but I can't hear her. But, come back to that.
Yeah, it might be hard for her to type into the chat when she's on her phone. I know
Tracy, because I know it's you, do you want to just text me your question and then I'll read it out? Like text me as in on my phone? Yeah, cool. Does anybody else have a question? And that can include the lovely people who are hosting today.
Yeah, I might ask a question.
Sure.
Something that I've found as personally as an artist that's always been a challenge, which is like a pressure of time. I
Hmm.
think in the arts world, there's a lot of value on labor, and I attended a a talk on craft and disability, and there's this culture, I think, in craft, which also translates to the other, methods of art making that you need to do a certain amount of labor to sort of gain your qualifications and your status as an artist and we get if you get the opportunities to have an exhibition, there's the time pressures. So do you see that more that changing at all, like within the arts culture, when you talked about it a little bit in the
Yeah.
pressure of theater and all of
Yeah.
those culture of of the rush, I think, of production.
Yeah. I think there's two elements to that for me, and thank you for the question, Belinda. And I think the two elements for that are me are rushing from a career sense and then rushing from a product sense. And I don't want to talk about not that I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk over, what was spoken about, I'm sure, at that craft, because I think that's where the forms can differ, and I'm much more a theater artist and a writer than I am anything else. One place that I do see it is, and this is a continued conversation across the arts. I am far from the first person to say this, but when we look at definitions for grants, for example, that talk about emerging artists, what does emerging mean? I'm very not sure what emerging means, because I was a full-time staffer at an arts organization, but I felt very early career. Now, part of that be imposter syndrome, of course, uh, which is always sort of lingering over many of our shoulders. At best, you know, professional artist. I came to feel comfortable with that. Um, I think it's how we conceive of ourselves. Much as the same. We have this conversation with authors. They think in the arts, but like, you know, it's never too late to write a book. Um, right? I think there is a pressure, especially when you're in a space that isn't disability led, and I would argue that even some of those disability led spaces can easily trend along typified lines of timeline. I think it's just about trying to engage with the needs of the people in the room, whether that's changing up what a rehearsal schedule looks like, whether that's knowing that you're just going to have a longer creative timeline and that jamming it all together for somebody else's approval may not be a good fit.
Did we get Tracy's question? I'm not sure if the question in the chat is
I
from
was able,
her.
I'm able to get on, I
Oh,
think.
there we
Oh,
go. Hi,
great.
Tracy. I can hear you.
Hi. Hi, John.
Hope rehearsal's going well.
Rehearsal's going very well, and I'm not coming off video because I'm scrambling to get ready for an interview and rehearsal. However, I just have a quick, well, maybe two quick questions.
Sure.
One is, can you talk a little more about the need for folks to understand the place of awkwardness and discomfort as an asset to moving this intention forward? The intention that I'm talking about is educating Saskatchewan community on disability culture.
Sure.
And then second thing, John, I've got four, but I will not do that. Second thing, John, is you spoke very early on as the wants, like the wants for there to be more access, like the want of people to create more access. And I would love to hear from your perspective what the needs are from our own internalized experience, not just LTDs, of course, but the broader community experience.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I'll start with wants first. I think that there are two levels of wants. I think the arts in Saskatchewan is still a sector, I would argue this applies in most provinces, where disabled people look at it and go, not for me. Very difficult for people to see themselves inside of this ecology, especially when it's that shift, Belinda, you brought forward between, emerging versus professional artists. There are plenty of people who will see themselves as creative, I would argue, but we're still battling against organizations, nonprofit organizations outside of the arts, doing arts sessions that are essentially, I guess the joke used to be, just basket weaving. In terms of wants, my internalized want is for there to be more space for learning. I mentioned earlier about students not really being given that access. I think when we talk about access to the arts, we often talk about representation. Every disabled artist could come through Saskatoon, and I'm not sure I would feel any closer to the Saskatchewan arts ecology. I mean, it'd be fun to go out for a meal and complain about the barriers that we've all faced, but representation can only take us so far. So my internalized want is for us to disrupt, and quite frankly, that action, the action that is needed. Sure, it requires lots of disabled people in the room, but it also requires plenty of uncomfortable conversations at administrative levels, not just in the sort of nonprofit funder sector, but looking at you, Saskatchewan government, because this all intersects with things like SED and our income barriers, Saskatchewan Insured Income for Disability. There are so many interconnected barriers. Our lack of a provincial bus travel. There are so many things. It requires uncomfortable conversations between people, even when disability identity isn't front and center, or there aren't people in the room who do identify with that experience. In terms of internalized barriers, I think for me, the key to understanding internalized barriers is that disabled artists, it's often a term called access friction. It used to be called access conflict. A whole argument on social media about who came up, not a friendly argument about who came up with it, because nobody can quite decide. Again, going back to my point about knowing our histories. But access friction is this idea that, Tracy and I have worked together for a very long time. There are still things that we are obviously not inside of each other's brains. There are just things that we may bump into. I gave the scheduling example earlier. Weather deeply affects that, my body. So access friction might be, hey, this was a perfect schedule 4 days ago. How can I navigate that? I know I need to be there. How can I get there? How can we? I know I have to be there, right? I can't always move everybody's schedule for me, but maybe there's an extra rest time that I need to take. And that's part of the conversation. And I think that's a conversation often, again, we think about the internalized wants, not saying that Tracy is, because I don't think they are, but we have to think of those wants as like disabled wants in opposition to the traditions of theater, to use theater. And those, what can seem like a minor inconvenience can actually make a major impact on a day. So I think the internalized want is to have those uncomfortable conversations, even within disability community. Tracy said, yes, great. What do the CRIP community members need to feel safe to disrupt? I feel we LTD feel safe because we have really truly leaned into interdependence, and that structure, although sometimes difficult, provides the safety we require to feel like it's okay to disrupt. Yeah, I think it takes the arts ecology to take a risk to actually say, I mean, this is a minor example, but sort of like, I don't care if this is an arts administrator saying it, it takes one of these larger organizations to say, I don't care how much pushback we get. I'm going to include disability culture as part of this mandate where possible, aware of barriers. It takes a theater to say, no, I'm not going to, and this is a minor example, but I'm not going to sell that. We're at capacity, and yes, I don't see a disabled person, and yes, we could sell that seat to a non-disabled person, but I'm not going to do that because a disabled person could come in right afterwards. It takes training volunteers. There's just so many ways in which larger organizations can disrupt and welcome in disabled artists. I want disruption to be something an individual can do and feel safe in doing, rather than having to be something that is the mantle of the privileged few.
I think you've sort of answered the other question that we had, which was, are there any actions that we as individuals or as members of the community or an arts organization that we can incorporate moving forward? So making space, considering timelines. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long list, isn't it? And we're resisting the and yes, I will get to your question, Dean. Sorry, that's definitely how my brain works. Just, sorry, Belinda, could you? I bumped myself off track by looking at Dean's question, which is definitely not Dean's fault.
Well,
is there anything else we should add?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult because there is no, like I said, there is no checkbox narrative. I think it involves looking at your role. I think it starts individually, not you specifically, Belinda. Sorry, not to point straight at you. Our role, whether that's our roles as artists, administrators, people getting into the arts, teachers who have never thought about disability art and said, actually, how does access and inclusion, intimate access, as Mia Mingus would put it, how does that revolve around my role, even if there is a role that you may not conceive as involving disability at all? It may be a day, because so many of us hold day jobs outside of the arts. How could it be involved in collections? How could it be involved, but also how could it be involved in, a partner's office job or something, and building from there, seeing what you don't see, right? And then going out and reaching out to see where you might be able to learn some things.
Dean, did you want to hop on here?
You can say it if you want, Dean.
My mind's like yours, John. It kind of jumps, so I'll forgo that first question.
Okay, sure.
And I was thinking about, like you said, for someone like SaskCulture, with all of these organizations that often look to us, how do you juggle? There is no checkbox, but people really want checkboxes, because that, how do you? I mean, doing the disability audit and things like that was very helpful, but in terms of any resources or anything that you thought would be really helpful for all of these organizations that we work with that come to us and maybe come to you as they have?
Sure.
What's the best advice?
I think one of the I shouldn't say easiest, that'll get me in trouble, but I think one of the ones that can, and this is close, I think, to a checkbox thing that I'll get, is one of the things that gets radically misunderstood, not just in the arts ecology, but in terms of accessibility and inclusion in general when it comes to disability, is that disabled people, by and large, will self-select to not to show up to something. So a lot of the approach historically has been, well, if there's a disabled person, we'll figure it out. To mix an idiom, we will burn that bridge when we come to it, right? However, that's not how disability access works, right? Somebody who has, even people who are early into their understandings of disability, particularly physical disability, but I think it branches out to invisible disabilities as well, is that, if your access isn't front and center on a website, even in a sign, if you don't have captioning, if you aren't putting forward that there should be an interpreter for something like this, if you're not being forward with not only just what you can offer, but what you can't offer, you know, an accessible washroom is over there, or we don't have an perfectly accessible washroom, but there's one in our organization down the hall. Like, who knows what that looks like, right? But I think the biggest thing, if we look on social media, providing alt text for images, these are all, you know, not everything about access has to be this giant lift. And I think that's the closest I would get to that small thing. People look to you, absolutely, and it's not a checkbox, but it is, there are certainly, I would argue, things that are really forward-facing and really quite telling.
Thank you.
I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Is there any other burning questions, or maybe this is a good place to wrap it up? I think a lot of the things you've talked about, John, you've written about as well. So I would encourage,
what I repeatedly do, yes.
I would encourage everyone to check out John's website, so you can think more about these issues. There was an article about, you know, you talked a little bit, people coming late to disability, people who've born with disabilities and those different experiences, and thinking that you can't just group, not everyone's the same, has the same experiences and the same needs. So that's
was that the one about COVID?
Yeah, and on your blog about the community itself. And so I think that's those are really good things to think about. So I would want to thank you, John, for like a really thoughtful and being so open with your sharing your experiences. We do appreciate that. I want to also thank Barb Froese, who has done an amazing job with translation today. It's been fun kind of watching her translate some of the terms and things.
Belinda, can I just answer Dean's question? Just
oh, sure, yeah.
Dean's a very busy human, as we all are, so maybe running away. Dean, that term is, I just want to clarify, is not mine. It's Brianne Vanessa's, but I did the story where she was interviewed by me about it. I've interviewed her a couple times about it, but maybe the most readable one, because I'll be critical of my own writing, is a CBC article. I don't have the exact title in front of me, but disability can be a lifeline social media can be a lifeline for disabled people. It was for CBC. It was a reported piece, thanks to Natasha Lipney, a producer that I work with quite often.
Well, thanks for that, John. So yeah, I wanted to thank Barb, thank John, Joyton and Chip, who have done the organizing and the tech support, which is really grateful. And I just wanted to do a little shout out. I think most people are aware now that we had a special anniversary this month. Sask turned 75, and we're going to be celebrating that by looking at 75 established artists in the province. We've asked them to highlight and recommend 75 either emerging or future artists that we should know about, or organizations, and we're going to be featuring those on our social media and on our website over the coming year. So they've already been started, so keep an eye out for those on our website and on our social media. And then we have another one more in this series talk coming up in the future that we're still organizing, and you can keep an eye out for that as well. So thanks again to everyone for taking the time to join us today, and have a great day. And yeah, once this is posted in a couple weeks on our website, I think it's really one worth sharing, and we'll be promoting it as well on our social media. So thanks everyone.